Going live. Hello and welcome everyone to the sixth session of Nick Land's Bitcoin and Philosophy seminar. I'm going to pass it on to Nick to begin his lecture.
Okay, cool. So the preset topic for this week was cryptography, or especially concentrating on the crypto aspects of it. So I was thinking we could have a little preliminary discussion of public key cryptography. And then I've got a couple of pieces in the classroom that both, I think, could be really stimulating foci for conversations. I got something from Ivan, which actually was raising something that I think has been coming up a lot, understandably. I've been sort of kicking it down the road, which is this whole question about the relation of this Bitcoin topic to what is perhaps the most excited philosophical discourse on finance currently, which is, I think, can be really traced back to Ali Ayash. Ivan actually refers to John Roth, if I'm pronouncing his name right, who's one of the writers in the Collapse volume. I enjoyed his piece a lot in that volume. I don't know much about his work beyond that, but it definitely seems to me there is, even though it's a very complicated bridge to cross, I think there's enough there to start at least understanding the terms of that crossing and how one would begin to move between these two different types of discussion. And the second piece, or the second actually set of stimulus, came from Laura on stuff that we talked about last time. Now, she sent 3 different links, and I'm afraid the only one that I'm at all on top of at this stage is the first of them, which is a link to Brett Scott's article that was alluded to last time, because of the fact that he'd criticized the notion of money as a store of value. Now, I actually recognized this article when I saw it. The first time I looked at it was I was not reading it very carefully. I looked at it a little bit more carefully this time. But there's also plenty there to trigger a set of discussions. He makes 3 particular points, what he calls myths about money that need to be dispelled, and they're all at least interesting, if I think in certain respects his unambiguous attitude to all of them is to me a little bit hasty, but we can see what people think about that. So if it's okay with people, I thought we'd start with the cryptographic topic and then perhaps move on to these other ones, along with anything else that people want to introduce. So right from the start, I have included on our syllabus a link to this 1976 paper by Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman, called New Directions in Cryptography, dating all the way back to 1976. I mean, which I guess to a lot of people seems like ancient history now. I would say that this essay, which is actually a lot more demanding than the Bitcoin paper, but is probably the second most important reference on the reading, at least in terms of its direct relevance to this thing. And I think understanding public key cryptography, at least to some extent, and I'm not at all pretending to have a exceptional mastery of it. I mean, I'm at basically Wikipedia level of understanding of public key cryptography, but I think that's already enough from my point of view to be quite astounded by the importance of it, and to see firstly how it's absolutely fundamental to the possibility of Bitcoin, as well as many other things, and secondly how its historical importance is really hard to overestimate. I mean, it's a quite extraordinary advance in I don't know how you'd want to categorize it, in human culture in general, or something more than that. That maybe something that we want to try and pin down later. And I think the best way of understanding quite how important it is that it's comparable in certain ways to a bunch of things that have a very similar historical structure. And the two obvious ones, I think, that have exactly this shape to them is the history of logic and the history of money. Now, obviously, this last one, I'm going to use Bitcoin basically as the example for that. The history of logic, simply to say that people talking about Gödel coding and the kind of revolution that he introduced in the 1930s to do with the understanding of the possibility of the logicization of mathematics, attempted to say something like, he's one of the two greatest logicians in history, along with Aristotle, then a pause and then say, no, he's the greatest logician in history. And the deep structure of that is that there's really a prehistory which goes all the way up to Gödel, and then there's this massive break, and then there's something that is truly modern that happens. And you look for your ancient authorities, and they're people who really systematize a certain kind of common sense. That, Aristotle, of course, is used as a reference because he tells us what everyone thinks logic has to be like in a way that is convincing. But you only get the counterintuitive break at this last stage where something happens that no one could have predicted, and that you have a subject that has lasted for thousands of years with minor refinements and slight nudges and transformations, and then at a certain point it undergoes this catastrophic rupture and you're in a totally different world. So the whole long arc that is can be condensed in a certain way by the attempt to understand the relationship between arithmetic and logic, slowly closing on this possibility of producing a logical system for arithmetic that seems to be heading towards some state of perfection where people think they've almost got there. And obviously in these famous names like Russell and Peano in the early 20th century, it looks like it's finally just about to arrive, and then Gödel comes along and says this is totally misconceived, and he says it in such a way that it is then definitive. That whole historical project has been obsolete, and everything that it was trying to do is now seen as being misconceived in this fundamental way. And the history of cryptography is exactly the same structure, in the sense that you can take the history back as far as you want before public key cryptography, and it has a continuity to it. There are all kinds of refinements and minor transformations, but the fundamental history of cryptography is a single story until you get to public key cryptography, and then it completely is revolutionized in a way no one had imagined before. And so if you're trying to identify what the principle of cryptography is prior to public key cryptography, the term that is used and is extremely helpful, it's a nice coinage because it is helpful and makes a lot of sense and captures the essence of the thing, is that all cryptography was symmetrical until you get to public key or asymmetric cryptography. And what is meant by symmetry there? It's actually very simple. The principle and the assumption of what it was for cryptography to operate, what a code, a cipher in that sense was, is that between the message and the crypto version of that message, between the plain text and the ciphertext, there is a difference that is described by a key. And there are all different kinds of candidates for this key. There are kind of letter substitutions. There are this old Roman way of winding a message around a stick of a certain width, and the amount of revolutions it did around that automatically encrypted the message. There's obviously very secure forms of symmetrical encryption using one-time pads where there is no cipher except for that message that is based on a particular key that is required by both parties. And everybody throughout, again, those thousands of years, I mean, it's probably a history longer than the history of an attempt to formalize logic, just assumed that, of course, cryptography was symmetrical. It was something that just seemed to be implicit in the very idea of cryptography. And that following from that, if you were able to encrypt a message, you were automatically able to decrypt it, and vice versa. There's a key, and the key transforms between a ciphertext and a plain text symmetrically, and therefore, if you could do one of these operations, you could do the other one inevitably and obviously and clearly. So that's one of the fundamental characteristics of symmetrical cryptography, cryptography as it has always been until 1976. The other characteristic that follows from that is that in order to have a crypto system, you have to have, I think, what can be fairly called a conspiracy. The people who are involved in the cryptographic exchange must get together outside the system. I mean, it's tempting if we're translating between the language of transcendental philosophy and these vocabularies to say they have to enter a transcendent space outside the system and exchange the key, so that they both actually, the act by which the key is shared is an act that takes place outside of the cryptographic economy that the key makes possible. You cannot communicate the key cryptographically. If you send it to someone in code, they can't use the key, and so they can't use it. Or if you sent it to them in a way that they could access the key from the message, then anyone could access the key from the message, and therefore it would be insecure. So there's no way with a symmetrical cryptographic system that you can actually enter into a cryptographic exchange without a conspiratorial moment outside of that circuit of cryptographic communication. Now, just practically speaking, that obviously becomes a huge problem. if there is a requirement for widespread crypto communication, because it's okay if you're a secret agent that you somehow get together with the people you're going to be communicating with before your mission starts, and therefore you've got the code, they've got the code, and then the mission starts and you've got your little cryptographic microeconomy. It just involves a limited number of people. It's something that's doable. But if you're engaged in commercial crypto communication, if you want to send payments cryptographically to some large company with millions of anonymous customers, it's completely impractical to use an to use a symmetrical cryptographic system to engage in that exchange. So the big change then that was independently invented. Diffie, Hellman in particular insists also that Ralph Merkle, who you've come across from the Merkle tree contribution, and maybe some other elements. He's obviously very active in this whole world. So Hellman says it should be called Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange. But it was independently invented a little bit just 1 year later by a team at MIT, which is Ron Rivest. Sorry, let me just look at this. Adi Shamir and Leonard Edelman. And their names were used then for the acronym of that, which is RSA encryption, which I'm sure everybody has heard of. So it's one of those things like calculus and innumerable other sort of massive breakthroughs that have this strange coincidental origin in that way, independent invention. But irrespective of that, the basic idea is this. And the reason it's called asymmetric is that the actions of encryption and decryption become broken in asymmetric cryptography. And it becomes broken on the basis of a particular type of double key. So rather than a single key, all symmetrical encryption has a single key. Asymmetric encryption has a double key. And the two sides of that key are mathematically bonded. They have a deep connection to each other, and you'll see the function of that as we talk about it. They're mathematically bonded, but between those two sides of the key, the two keys, that the relation is asymmetrical because it's easy to go in one direction and extremely difficult to go in the other direction. And we've already seen that asymmetry is cropping up over and over and over and over again here. I mean, I'm always tempted to see it as an index of time at work in these systems. We've seen that there's the various forms of entropy, of irreversibility tempts people, I think, often interestingly and productively to introduce this thermodynamic discussion that we're talking about an irreversibility of the same kind as any kind of entropic process that can go towards disorder but cannot be moved back to order practically. And it's also, as we've seen, that the form of the contract in general as a commitment also involves the notion of asymmetry. That the ideal, the model contract is facile to enter into and hard stroke impossible to back out of. That's implicit in a contract, that all of these tendencies towards fluid, frictionless commercial interaction require that it's extremely easy to make a deal But once you've made a deal, you can't retract that deal. So there's an asymmetric relationship that is intrinsic to the very notion of commercial exchange. And here we have another type of asymmetry. And the asymmetry here is between a mathematical function that connects these two keys. The facile key, we could say the simple key, is your public key. And bonded to that is a private key. And you cannot derive the private key from the public key tractably. So what we're really seeing here is a whole new way of hiding things, a way of hiding things that has never previously been entertained in the history of cryptography, and by that I think we mean history. It's a completely new understanding of secrecy and hiding, which I'm very inclined to call the open secret. The open secret is the same thing we see in Bitcoin on the ledger, in the fact that everything is completely exposed, and yet you still are able to engage in hidden activities. Hidden in that case because it's based on this cryptographic system, and more directly because your real life identity is hidden outside of the actual system of commercial exchange that Bitcoin realizes. The open secret in public key cryptography is realized by the fact that your public key can be completely exposed, and it works best if it is totally exposed to public circulation. So in this way it works like your public address. And when I say it works like, I mean these analogies, it's because there is the same technical mechanism behind it. So it's like your public address within the Bitcoin system. The more people know it, the better. If you want people to be able to pay you Bitcoins, you tell everybody your public address. In the same way with public key encryption, if you want to be able to communicate with people cryptographically, you put your public key on your business card. You share it, you put it up on the web, you completely hide it. The more you publicize it, the better. And your private key, just like your private Bitcoin address, is kept strictly to yourself. And as I say, you're able to do this because your private key cannot be derived from your public key, even though they are bonded together. And the example that I find, because as I say, my level of technical immersion in this is woefully limited, but I think the example that is easiest to understand, and it's the one historically that came first, it was actually anticipated by Jevons way back in the 19th century, in 1874, is prime number factorization. So that if you have two, we don't need to go for massive crypto security for our example. If you want to go for, if you have two largish primes, say just 10 digits each, and you can multiply them together with a calculator, even with a piece of paper, pretty fast. But using the same technology that you used to encrypt, if you then try to decrypt by then extracting those primes from the product of their combination, it takes vastly longer. I mean, I suspect that a really powerful computer can deal with 10-digit primes, but the amount of computation that would be required would be billions and billions and billions of calculations in order, by brute force, by trying out every plausible prime number, and therefore using this technique called Eratosthenes' net, which is the brute force method for prime factorization, it would eventually find it. But there is the key point is that there is a vast asymmetry between the ease of the encryption and the ease of the decryption if you don't have the key. That anyone can multiply these two primes together, and then they're faced with a number that they're told has only two prime factors, each of 10 digits, let's say, to make it easier, and it would take you unassisted vastly longer than the age of the universe to extract those prime numbers out of the number. And even a powerful computer takes huge amounts of computational effort, and if you make them a little bit longer, you can make it impractical even for the most powerful supercomputer to do that reversal, while leaving the original task, multiplying two largest primes together, extremely simple. So that's this example of a asymmetric mathematical relationship, and you can see from that it has everything. It works. That people use other methods. You know, the one that Bitcoin uses is this thing called elliptical curve cryptography, and I can only trust, because this is what I'm told by what I'm reading, that the abstract principle is the same. The abstract principle being that there is a massive asymmetry between the facility of encryption and the facility of decryption. So you can see, if you have a public and a private key related by this kind of mathematical relationship, they are bonded utterly and precisely together. There's no they're bonded so closely together that you obviously generate the public key out of the private key originally, and they're bonded together so closely that it will allow a whole bunch of operations, of which the most important we're just about to move on to. But even though there is this bond, it's completely inaccessible to anybody who has access to the public side of that pair. So you can float your public key without any concerns, and your private key, while attached to it inseparably, like a sort of dark twin, is not actually accessible. And so, as I say, this relationship between the public and private, the light and dark side of a cryptographic couple is a new understanding of secrecy. It's something that had never been anticipated before. But with it, everything becomes possible in the world that we're discussing. I mean, the most straightforward things that are already deeply entrenched is the whole infrastructure of conventional online commerce. You know, forget about cryptocurrencies, just talk about PayPal, or talk about even using your credit card to engage in online payments. Anything of that kind that involves you entering into a crypto-protected relationship with a stranger in a public communication channel is now feasible. And this is a huge thing. I mean, it's something that was completely impossible to achieve in advance of this step forward. So I'm going to stop on this in 1 second. I just want to say the two crucial functions. Once you've got your public and private key, you can do a whole bunch of clever things by combining them in certain ways. And there's two that are particularly important. So the first thing, everyone talks about Alice and Bob. I think it's because of the A and B thing there. So I might as well stick with convention. And we've got Alice and Bob who are trying to engage in crypto communication. So the first thing is that Alice wants to send Bob an encrypted message. Now, as I say, the only way in the prehistory of cryptography, in the symmetrical epoch of cryptography, that this could happen is if Alice and Bob conspire. At some point outside of the ecumenon, or outside the commercium, or however you want to describe it, the system, they have to get together and engage in an exchange of such that they both share a key that they both then are able to keep secret. In public key cryptography, that's unnecessary. All that is required is that Bob finds Alice's public key and uses it to encrypt a message and sends it to Alice. Now, because the system is asymmetric, Alice's public key cannot decrypt that message. Obviously, if it could, then there would be no cryptographic protection at all. Her public key is out there. Anyone can take it. They can take Alice's public key, get the message, use it, and decrypt the message. But the way PKC works is only Alice's private key will decrypt a message encrypted using her public key. So you can take a message, use Alice's public key, use that to encrypt the message, and then plaster that message everywhere completely openly, like obviously the blockchain. It's a totally open secret. You can tantalize people. I am sending Alice a secret message of extreme importance that everyone would be fascinated by. I'm using nothing to encrypt it but her public key. Here it is. Boom, for your thing. The only person who can decrypt that message is the person who has Alice's private key. We will assume Alice. So this allows secure crypto communication across a public channel. And it's something that just simply hadn't been seen as being possible prior to this revolution in cryptography. The other thing that you can do, which is almost as important, is digital signatures. And as we've seen with Bitcoin, the notion of a signature becomes extremely important in this recent phase of cryptography. I mean, the notion of a signature has always been extremely important. It's always been a mark of identity, and it's obviously used prior to this kind of level of sophistication. Very blurry forms of bio-identification. You know, your signature is assumed no one can forge your signature plausibly. I mean, people were not in a position to do iris scans or complicated forms of these bio-identification. So they use these very, very crude and what look now very hazy forms of identification through things that are supposed to be marks of your biological identity that can't be forged. But obviously, just like the problem of putting money into cyberspace, the problem of putting identity into cyberspace falls prey to what we've been seeing on the monetary side as the double spending problem. Like, the whole medium is designed for near free copying. So how can you possibly have a form of identity on the web that is secure, that acts as a reliable signature? And this is a huge, serious problem, but it's one again that's solved by public key cryptography. And in this case, you reverse the thing, and if you want to provide a signature, you use your private key, and you send a message in your private key, and it can only be extracted by someone who has your public key. Now that could be anybody. So it's the opposite of a crypto communication. A signature is not meant to be kept secret. It's like if you sign something, it's not that your signature is any kind of secret. What the relation that's important there is that your signature cannot be forged, that you're proving identity. And you prove identity because the fact is, if you sign something digitally using your private key, your public key will show that it was you who signed it, or the person who signed it had to have been someone with access to your private key. So ownership of your private key becomes the key, the principle of identity. It's the kind of bottom line at this stage. There's nothing more basic to being you than this relationship of cryptographic propriety over a private key. And this too, as you can imagine, is of extraordinary importance, to be able to actually prove irreversibly and definitively that you signed something, that the only way in which you could not have been the person who signed it is if you've let someone else steal your private key. And obviously then you're basically saying you've let someone steal your identity. So I think rather than just carrying on indefinitely with this, because there are other things we want to talk about, I'll kind of draw a close to this particular block at this point and see whether anyone has anything they want to discuss about public key cryptography.
Nick, I'm quiet because I'm still trying to figure out the relationship between private and public and conceptualize it in my mind, how they work.
Yes.
I've been just drawing.
It is something that takes a bit of mental juggling, I think. I mean, if there's anything I can do to try and clarify, I would probably be repeating, but that can sometimes be helpful. I think the important thing to remember is that, I mean, public key and private key are rigidly bonded together, that the private key is the hidden part of the relation, and it's hidden because of the fact that there's an asymmetric difficulty of getting from one to the other. To get from the private key to the public key is not a problem, but to get to the private key from the public key is all but impossible. And because a key pair there, and you can put the public key out in the public domain, it means that if you encrypt something with a public key, it requires decryption by the corresponding private key. And so on one side you can use that to prove, if you start by encrypting something with a private key, you can prove who encrypted that. That's the digital signature option. Or if, say, Mo, I wanted to send you a message that was secure, I would find your public key. You could just simply put it with your ID somewhere on the net. I would look at it, I would read your public key, I would take my message, and I would use your public key to encrypt a message to you. Now, the only message could then be decrypted is with your private key. So this means that I can send you, without us ever having conspired, without us ever having entered into any kind of relationship, private offline relationship, in which we have exchanged some kind of cryptographic protocol with each other, transcendently, I would say, in Kantian mode, without any of that being necessary, I, just by seeing your public key and by you having a private key, I can send you an entirely secure crypto communication. Obviously, then, if you wanted to then reply to me, you would need my public key. I can't get, if you encrypt something using your public key, no one can get to it but you. So if you want to send a message to me, you need my public key, and then I have to use my private key to decrypt it. But if you wanted to prove who you were to me, you would use your private key, and then anybody could use your public key, and that would prove beyond any doubt that you were the person who had signed that document.
Can I make a comment on this kind of idea of the open secret, sort of in general?
Yes.
Sorry, I've got some cat interference. Bradley. Perhaps outside of the Bitcoin or the blockchain mechanism, in which this is perfectly important, isn't the kind of the importance of having two levels of language, of having an esoteric and an exoteric level of language, the fact that there is a possibility to decipher it, if only you have the right kind of knowledge, or you've earned it, or you've figured it out in some way, or you've been initiated into certain realms of knowledge that give you the tools to decipher it. And so you become party to the secret through a kind of labor, but one that is possible.
Yeah.
So there is a symmetry, but it's a very specific, qualified symmetry. And so the whole kind of game of employing this two levels of communication or transmission is to be able to work both, to make it intelligible esoterically, but not transparent exoterically.
Yeah.
And so again, this is my problem with the temporality as an asymmetrical temporality in terms of production. That there's a kind of shutting down of a lot of the fun possibilities in this, in the fact that it is so kind of rigidly structured.
Secure.
Yeah. I mean, this is really just an aesthetic point.
Sure, and I would say about that like, you know, I'm not going to explore your financial circumstances, but I'm pretty sure that there's a certain level where you don't want people engaging in aesthetic experimentation with your bank account. And so there is that level of a kind of absolutized asymmetry. I mean, it clearly isn't absolute ever in a kind of strictly conceptual sense. You know, we're talking about, you know, it's always a quantitative increase in security, and you can say, look, this would take the biggest supercomputer in the world 50 trillion years to break, or whatever. No, let's make it 100 trillion years. No, let's make it 200 trillion years. I mean, but you never get to infinite security in a purely conceptual way. But you get so far beyond what can be played with that it might as well be absolute. But there's no reason why this whole spectrum needs to be down at this quasi-absolute end, except that we're dealing with certain practical problems where people are only interested in that end. It's like, let me give you an example. This little quote, I don't know whether people saw it. It's I think right now, and perhaps forever, but I have to see about that, is my favorite quote in the whole history of philosophy. I'm absolutely hopeless at classical languages, so I'm not making any pretense at this. But I've struggled a bit just because I love it so much, which is this quote from Heraclitus: "Phusis cryptisthai philae," meaning translated or usually as "nature loves to hide." But you can see, even with my level of grotesque incompetence at classical languages, that this "to hide," cryptisthai, is the root, shares the root of cryptography. It's a kind of sign that there's a cryptographic problem at the absolute origin of Western philosophy. Now that is fragment 123 of Heraclitus, and fragment 123 is a very interesting number because it actually is like a toy version of the kind of prime number based cryptographic asymmetry we've been talking about. It's an extremely insecure one, which means you should like it. It means it's aesthetically accessible, because 123 has two prime factors, 3 and 41. So it's a little model of that asymmetry, and it's maybe a little bit hard to see because it is so far from the absolute end we've been talking about. You know, if the kind of a good piece of RSA encryption would take a supercomputer 20 trillion years to solve, fragment 123 would take it like some fraction of a nanosecond to solve. But it means it's in our aesthetic play zone. You know, there's a whole, that aesthetic play zone is as large as you want it to be. You know, so these numerical relationships aren't all, you don't need to be dealing with 10-digit, 20-digit, 30-digit primes. You can be dealing with, in this case, a 2-digit prime and 1-digit prime. I mean, and the reason I'm saying this is that obviously the kind of occult traditions that have played around with these things are in this zone. Maybe they swim a little bit deeper in, but they don't swim down to these zones of deep cryptographic security. They swim down to a zone where someone who involves themselves in playing the game can encrypt and decrypt these messages or make sense of them. And the people, the vast majority of the audience who simply are not involved in that game will be deterred from it, in sense, kept out of its esoteric dimension. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, you know, the reason that these things seem hard, in the sense you're using that word, hardened, rigid, is because of the application, and the application demands a certain quantitative dimension that is not intrinsic to the abstract machinery that we're talking about. That quantitative level, the fact that you're talking about 128-bit encryption isn't intrinsic in the abstract cryptographic protocol. It's simply to make it secure, because people want their money to be secure. They want to be able to pass messages that are truly secure to each other. But there's a whole playground of low security cryptographic procedures, and they're completely open to people, and they're available to use, and I would say have been systematically used. I think the obvious example, as I say, is in various kinds of occult sign systems.
Thanks.
So the potential to encrypt strange attractors, or like truly conductive signs, I don't know if that's the right word, is fully strengthened by this. So it could be revolutionary in a way that we haven't seen, because it could happen as fast as anything does on the internet now. Is that something like what you're suggesting?
Actually, I'm not fully getting. Can you just try to gloss
Sure.
that by fractionally different way? Yeah, I'm not.
So if we've reached a level of asymmetrical encryption that is flawless, and a message can be sent that can only be decrypted if the intent is there and the person encrypting it at a non-transcendental
Right.
level, then isn't there much greater potential for proliferation of, I said strange attractors, but I mean for more conductive, I don't know, symbols is the word I said. I guess I have to think through this a little more. But it's just interesting to me that you are now capable of transmitting really big, serious sets of information instantly with complete security.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it obviously depends what your sort of application is, and where Amy's coming from. Is a very different application to the one that is the mainstream application of the topic we're talking about, and so I think there's a certain frustration on that side. But my response to that, and I'm sorry, I'm just probably being repetitive here, is that there's nothing intrinsic in the machinery that is producing a partition here. The partition is totally quantitative, and it's just because people have dialed up the security of the encryption to a point that's functional for these particular applications. And there's a whole unexplored zone, and I agree totally with Amy on this. It's just a massively the potential of this as an aesthetic playground is vast if you dial it back down again, you know. And by dialing back down, obviously we're in a way leaving our topic. We're leaving Bitcoin, we're leaving a cryptocurrency, and we're turning it into something else by, you know, what are these cultural machines if they are being applied at extremely low levels of crypto security, but just in order to investigate and explore and play with these semiotic machines, which are extremely intrinsically powerful, that they can do these weird, strange things. And I think people have not, you know, I think that's a missing zone of cultural experimentation, personally. You know, I think there's a lot of extremely advanced, productive experimentation happening up at this high security end. But I think down at the low security end, where it's really being used as just an object of aesthetic involvement, it's completely open to being used there, but I just don't see a lot yet happening of that kind. And I guess I'm just trying to say there's no reason why it shouldn't happen. It's yeah.
I guess to tie it back to what we were saying last week, I was just thinking it could be not just aesthetically fascinating, but it could undermine, you know, the institution or the academy. It could provide for a lot of interesting academic development, even all kinds of stuff. But I'm running on, so thanks for your reply.
At any stage where people want us to just jump forward to one of these other topics, just give some kind of indication. I mean, it's definitely possible always to go back. Can I just ask, sorry to just pick on Amy here, but what does SOS actually mean? Is that in some kind of code?
Sorry. No, maybe. Sorry for dragging
Okay,
the
I've
topic
just got
away from
11
where it was
o'clock.
supposed to be.
11 o'clock. Sods. Okay, that's Australian. It's an Australian thing. I don't have to
Maybe.
try and numerize it or break it down into prime factors or anything like that. Okay.
No, but maybe I'm gonna.
Okay.
Well, I guess we could talk about the Swan paper if anyone's interested in that, or if this.
Sorry, which one are we talking about? The thing Ivan linked to, this John Roth thing, or Laura's Brett Scott paper?
I was looking at the Brain as a Decentralized Autonomous Organization paper, but
oh yeah,
that might have been.
Okay, no, that sounds great, but I think I might need some prompts about what's going in there. Yeah, no, hang on. This is Melanie Swan's thing, is that?
Mm-hmm.
Give me the ref again to that. Yeah.
Do you want the link?
Thought
it's called Blockchain Thinking.
Yeah,
the
no,
Brain
I know where we are now. I know where we are.
DAC.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting. I'll let you take the lead if you want to go in that direction. But I was interested in the paper.
Yeah, no, do go ahead for sure. Yeah, any comments you have on that?
Well, I mean, the proof of intelligence is most problematic to me. I mean, we definitely have like proofs of knowledge or knowledges. And her definition of thinking as computation is one we've seen, but that's also what we use for an algorithm. But it was attractive to me too, is like just the notion of I don't know, uploading mind files, or that's a VR thing that is pretty intriguing. Mind uploads, or personal connectome files, as she calls it.
Yeah.
And so that was a potential in the blockchain architecture that is just fascinating to me.
Yeah. No, I thought her paper was absolutely fascinating. Definitely, it's one of the most, whatever points of it one agrees with or disagrees with or is appalled by or whatever, it's as a piece of philosophical stimulation, it was just extraordinary. So.
Agreed. Very much so.
Yeah, sorry. This is from this paper we were talking about. Is Chris has brought it up? Is Melanie Swan's paper that there's a link to on the Classroom? Sorry, is that Mo? Yeah.
Yes, it's just I had to step away for a second. I just missed the reference.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. It's already on there. Yeah, Chris was just talking about it.
Thank you.
Is why it came up. Actually, though, I think if it's okay with you, Chris, we've got scheduled a focus next week, I think, on the whole proof of work question, and using that as a kind of lever in some of these questions about power and reopening this kind of politics of Bitcoin thing at a high level of abstraction. And I think that context would be very good for the Swan piece. So I'm sort of tempted to kick that can down the road one week.
I agree.
I have a general.
That sounds wonderful.
Yes.
Related, at least a little bit, to cryptography. When you were speaking about identity and the idea of protecting your identity, it makes sense in the sense of having a bank account or a digital wallet, and you want to protect somebody from taking your money and making sure the exchange of money is secure. But I was thinking just generally about the stealing of identity and the duplication of identities in the public digital sphere, such as on Facebook, where somebody will steal your images and pretend to be you. And then specifically, because I'm really interested in music, I was thinking about MP3s and the stealing of music. And I was just wondering, are there any examples, and if not, why not, of people trying to implement a kind of public ledger within music files or for images, so that you can trace which ones are illegal copies and which ones have been bought and so forth? Because it seems kind of, I mean, I don't know how difficult or unrealistic it is, but, you know, possible.
Actually, Ian, I think that is a very fully articulated goal of certain sidechain applications, you know, a sort of application that people would click onto the blockchain precisely in the way that you're saying, as a proof of creation, or using that whole proof of identity structure to stamp something with your authorial or creative signature. So I think that is definitely going to happen. You know, so far as the whole thing moves at all, I think we can be totally confident that is an application that we will see happening, because I've seen it as an acknowledged objective already. And I think that you're right to say the technology should totally. That's going with the grain of the technology to a huge extent. There's nothing that should be particularly onerous about that. So all of these credentialing operations to do with a proof of identity at a certain time. Obviously, as we know, the blockchain is at its fundamental thing is this time stamping system, to say that at time X this happened, and the thing that happened has a signature attached to it. Remember, also a coin is just a string of signatures. So the kind of thing you're suggesting is something that is extremely locked into the basic mechanism of the blockchain, for sure.
Right. Yeah, it's just I find it, the idea, as we were talking about with the idea of, as your idea of commutative or commutation is, I'm just trying to think how relevant it is here, because we're not talking about money. So does that principle apply to, say, a music file? The notion of commutation? I mean, especially if there's no limit to how many, nobody says, oh, I'm only going to make 10,000 of these MP3s of this particular song.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I mean, I think we get back to this thing that anything that's using the blockchain is a coin. You know, so this suffix, X coin, Y coin, whatever coin. So this would be, as I say, I could, you know, if I looked, searched the web for a little bit, I'm sure I could find there is a coin that's already doing this. But I would just make one up on the spot and say this is like ID coin or whatever, okay? So ID coin does exactly the things that you're saying. But it is a coin. It must be if it's going to use the blockchain. And in order to be a coin, it has to have this economic dimension to it to some extent. Now these systems, there's a very interesting one called Namecoin that is supposed to ultimately put the whole of the web address system on. Would totally get rid of the Okay, sorry, there's a bit of weird stuff going on in the
Yeah,
system.
I think you're muted for a second there on accident.
Um, yes, it would get rid of the currently existing internet institutions to do with domain name registration or whatever, and just put the whole of that machinery onto the blockchain. So it's not exactly the same as what you're saying, but there is a kind of structural relationship to that. But that too would be it's name coin, it's a certain type of coin, and therefore it has an ineliminable economic element to it. So I think because it's only going to work if people have, if not mining, then something that is analogous to mining, in that there's an economic incentive to maintain and reproduce the system. So if you try to take that element out, then there's simply those guarantees that the system depends upon are taken out too, and it simply won't work. So you have to somehow you have to have that enough of a speck of economic reality there to provide incentives for people to reproduce the system. So how that would work exactly in this identity system, I think, is an interesting form, and I think it would be you would have to spend some microparticle of this coin system in order to stamp your creations with your identity. I think that's what those coins would be for, and it would be one of the key things, obviously, of Bitcoin and all of them is that they're fractional to an extreme extent. You know, you can at the moment break down a Bitcoin into 1 million pieces. If necessary, they could do a soft fork to give you some more divisibility than that. So this is very easy for these systems to do. Anything involving micropayments and these microscopic economic functions. And I think that what you would have to do in this system is you would have to somehow acquire these ID coins. It would involve some kind of payment, and then you would spend them by stamping your production in such a way that they then became indelibly identified.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, this thing from Amy is very relevant up here.
I'll stick the link in the classroom for you later, Ian.
Yeah.
It kind of relates to the conversation that Mo was having with Dana in the classroom as well. I was going to stick it up there before, but I didn't really have time. But yeah, I think there's a whole kind of another conversation that can take place in relation to art and intellectual property as well.
Yes. Yes. I think also the same applies to the previous point, that there's a high security version that people will want for the obvious applications. You're like, if you were buying ID coin because you wanted to stamp your music or whatever it was with an indelible identity, you would probably want it to be secure. But there's nothing about it that couldn't allow all kinds of strange artistic games with identity to take place. It's just that you'd obviously again have to dial the security index down to a level where it became open to various kind of chaotic effects of various kinds. And obviously, if you did that, there'd be no point complaining if something happened that looked like an unpredictable type of identity theft that you didn't welcome.
this is a really loose kind of connection and something that I haven't thought out properly, but I was wondering, with the kind of the stuff we were talking about the other week about mainstreaming.
Yeah.
And is there a kind of advantage in the, I mean, the fact that we're talking about something that is totally secure, there is no level of deception involved, and the traction that that kind of appearance can have in terms of this goal, perhaps, depending on who you talk to, of Bitcoin going mainstream. Like,
right.
it's not a kind of coup in any sense. It's a complete open assertion of a system and its advantages, rather than a kind of takeover from behind. I don't know. This is just something that I kind of thought of really roughly. Then.
Sorry, when you
see
say
any connection between that?
it's not a coup. Sorry, did I just interrupt somebody? Sorry, did I just shout over somebody then? No, I just wanted to get a clarification. We say it isn't a coup. What's it there? You mean
The mainstreaming
Bitcoin?
of Bitcoin.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I
Because
don't know,
it
because
operates
it's
on this
kind of
level of
organ.
utter sincerity.
Yeah, but both sides are equally equally enthused by the possibility of absolute hard crypto in this, aren't they? I mean, you know, you've got on the one hand these ultras, the cypherpunk guys, and they absolutely are totally uncompromising on this. I mean, you know, to just be stereotypical about it, or stereotyping about it. I mean, let's say they all have their tinfoil hats on. They all think that the NSA is trying to break into their private communications and empty their Bitcoin wallets. I mean, those guys, the anti-mainstreamers, are no less attached to the most radical, hard cryptographic security as the mainstreamers are. I think both sides of that debate are attached to absolute crypto security, or as close, you know, when I say absolute crypto security, as I say, I don't mean infinite crypto security. I mean crypto security so hard that for all practical purposes it's unbreakable. And I think that that's a constant across that particular spectrum. And the sort of issues you've been raising about, well, what about the other end? What about you know, malleable plastic low crypto versions of this, low security versions, is something that is crossing at another angle to both sides of that spectrum.
Yeah, good point.
What about political appliement of cryptography? I mean, it it can sounds a very democratic idea that anybody can vote, and every vote counts, and no vote can be can be fake. But
Yeah.
I know that you are not big fan of democracy. So how do you see this? Or you don't think that the cryptography have any political appliement? I mean, not influence on politics. I mean only appliement.
I think this is a huge issue. If anyone is interested in talking about the politics of Bitcoin, you know, it gets back to me to this thing about peer-to-peer. I think it's the fundamental ideological fork of modernity. That if you say we're aiming for pure, uncontaminated peer-to-peer relations, what is the ideology of that claim? which, as I've said before, it seems to me like that is the teleological omega commitment of the deepest modern tradition. And I think it splits radically because, and all political language splits with it. And the language of democracy can be used as an example of this for sure. Like, it's flat in this strict Kantian transcendental sense, flat because of the fact there's no transcendent oversight. There's nothing standing above on this metaphysical level above the transactional bond between two nodes that are not defined at all except immanently by the fact that they're nodes within this system. Those nodes can interact fluidly without any interruption from an external thing. Now, is that a democratic or an anti-democratic relation? And I think that both sides need to be taken extremely seriously. When in the deepest and most classical sense, the liberal tradition holds itself to be profoundly democratic, I don't think that's simply risible. I think it's something that is a serious claim because it's saying that what that peer-to-peer bond means exactly in the terms you say. Every node is formally privileged to the exact same extent within that system. But equally, when you've got these left critiques, like all serious left critiques are left critiques of liberalism in this, again, classical sense, and they say, as Marx does explicitly, no, that peer-to-peer bond is what allows any amount of substantial difference to be accumulated without interruption or without objection, so that as soon as you totally formalize that relation as a peer-to-peer relationship, all the things that are counted in the left critique of classical liberalism as forms of social and economic violence is opened. The Pandora's box is open to anything can happen and cannot be stopped. There's no agencies then that can police or interfere from outside. You can enter into any transactional relationship, and the substantial outcome of that relationship can be anything at all. There are simply no limits. There's no substantial limits to what that can entertain. So I think, my response to this is to say both sides are interesting and important, and the language is split in half in an extremely interesting way by this. I saw on Friday a kind of Bitcoin promo video that totally is using this language, and it's saying, Bitcoin is this new super democratic mode of financial organization because everyone gets a vote. And then the next stage of the argument, well, you can't have that it's one person, one vote, because any person could easily proliferate a whole bunch of false identities. It couldn't be checked. Someone could make up 1 million false personal IDs and therefore have 1 million votes. So you can't do that practically. So therefore, you have, this is what we're going to talk about next week, I hope. Therefore, you have the proof of work system, and therefore the vote is actually based on the computing power that is available to that node. And as we can see substantially, the variation in the computing power available to different nodes is open-ended. I mean, one node can be a Bitcoin mining super entity hidden somewhere in the depths of China, producing thousands of Bitcoins every hour. And another node is someone who just has a Bitcoin wallet and a mobile phone and has effectively zero mining capacity. So obviously from the left, you'd say, well, this is farcical to call this democracy. I mean, It's like, what are you even thinking when you use that language? Now, I don't want to be unambiguous about it like that at all. I think the ambiguity is crucial, because you have to understand it's not an accident, and I don't even think it's maliciously ideologically deceptive of that video to be using that language. You know, I don't think it's talking about democracy just in order to pull wool over people's eyes. I think it's based on a deep belief and a deep historically rooted sense of what democracy is and where it comes from, that is pushed into a certain extreme crisis by the purity that has now entered in terms of the differential between the formal and substantial characteristics of the relationship. You know, so that as soon as you really have something that is a pure peer-to-peer system, you can see how absolutely indifferent that system is to the substantial distribution that is involved in it. And so far, you know, I think all these things are happening at the same time.
It reminds me a little bit Bolshevism, especially Lenin. If we take Lenin's text beyond its aims, I mean, if we totally forget about socialistic ideas, about the aim to create the communistic society, beyond all that, Bolshevists tactics, it sounds very alike what you said now.
You couldn't just expand on that a bit, could you?
Excuse me?
Could you just expand a little bit, like why when you say it sounds very much alike?
I mean, if we'll take the existence of Bolshevist party beyond its ideology and aims, we'll see that they never had to. I'm sorry. They never had only one part. For example, Lenin insisted that communists must avoid only left part on the left way, and they must avoid only right way. It's anything goes. Anything goes. Which can help, which can continue the existence of the party, and which will increase its power. And it is not important. The ways are not really important. And
Right.
he insisted that we can work in. We Marxists, we can be against liberalism, against parliamentarism, and so on. But if we want to win, we must sometimes we must to go to the parliament and walk in the parliament, even it's a very reactionary parliament. If we want to win, we need to find allies in among liberals, even if we understand that they are our enemies, and so on.
Right. But to be honest, this sounds to me almost. It would be easier to see that as the opposite than as something analogous. I'll tell you why I think that. Because let's just treat the Bitcoin protocol as an omega instantiation of the classical liberal model, which, as I say, characterized by this purely formalistic peer-to-peer relation defended against any kind of encroachment. So it's a politically closed, commercially open system. Now, all of the ambiguities that then emerge from that come from its absolute principled formalism. You can absolutely loathe and despise that formalism and that principle. Of course, you can critique it as I don't know whether we're going to get onto the Brett Scott thing, but he is a very interesting left critic of Bitcoin, and I think he can probably be constructed in this kind of way. I'd have to see how that would roll out in discussion. But it's not at all opportunistic. There's no opportunism. In fact, it's the zero opportunism, the absolute inflexibility of its principle that is the target of what would be, and what I think already is, a left critique. The critique of, if it's broadened in abstraction to algorithmic government, where the rules, the principles, the laws simply cannot be violated irrespective of their substantial outcomes. So even, whatever it leads to substantially, it still is immune from any kind of modification or social answerability. It's structurally incapable of being adapted to deal with its substantial, or in response to its substantial outcomes. Whereas it sounds to me that the Lenin position that you're laying out there is the opposite. It's hyper opportunistic in the sense that it's saying that there's a certain substantial outcome that is our commitment, and whatever formal procedures are required to reach that substantial outcome should be tolerated. It's the substantial outcome that is the guideline or the principle, and there are no formal restraints. Any kind of alliance across ideological boundaries is fine, as long as we keep ourselves focused on the desired substantial result. So in terms of this basic question about hyper-formalism and its kind of realization in the Bitcoin protocol, it seems to me that the Leninist situation is the exact opposite of that.
Well, I can't answer you right now. It because I need a little bit more. I need better understanding of Bitcoin. It seems.
Sure. Well, let's. I think, as I say, we've got a kind of politics block set up in advance for next week, so we can definitely throw some Lenin into that for sure. I mean, if there was any particular text that you thought was particularly relevant to that, then you can stick it up on the classroom and everyone can have a look at it for sure.
Well, okay. Thank you.
I had a question about the point you just made, Nick, and that you made also at the beginning, the fact that Bitcoin is politically closed and commercially open, right? But my question is, what kind of market is Bitcoin actually creating, or has created so far? Because, like, premising that I don't hate the Bitcoin formalism, I actually love it, and I think I don't particularly like where is it situated, obviously. So my question is, the kind of market and commerce that Bitcoin is creating so far, anyway, is still very much dependent on perhaps what I see or I understand as a kind of transcendental entity, which is the US dollar, right? So any kind of commercial, speculative, generally financial venture that is, like, I don't know, undertaken these days involving Bitcoin is generally related or is generally compared somehow or depending on the price of the dollar, right? Or the price of Bitcoin compared to the dollar. So this is where, I don't know, I'm sorry I keep nagging about, I don't know
Yeah.
what's outside of the formalism of Bitcoin, but I think you cannot not take that into account. I mean,
No.
unfortunately, because again, I think the formalism of the blockchain is, I don't know, is amazing
Yeah.
and it has a lot of potential. But unfortunately, what I see again is like a series of like, I don't know, is a big, I don't know, capture of perhaps this, I don't know, the surplus of the blockchain in terms of what it offers, in terms of, as you were saying, like the open secret of, I don't know, this new kind of like cryptographic communication. So I don't know if you have any, I don't know, any comment on this area of, yeah.
Yeah. No, I do have a comment for sure. I mean, first of all, I think this is like super important. And I think there's two things I'd just immediately say in relation to the point you've just made. The first is that the relation to the US dollar seems to me almost entirely a straightforward consequence of the position of the US dollar in the world. You know, like, why do people fundamentally quote the price of Bitcoin in US dollars? Isn't it the same as the reason they quote the price of oil in dollars and the quote price of gold in dollars and the price of everything in dollars? Is because of the position of the US dollar in the world. It doesn't seem to me at all that this is an artifact that's coming from the side of Bitcoin. It's that simply Bitcoin has arisen in a world in which the US dollar is the international reserve currency, however sort of unstably right now, and therefore we automatically talk about it in those terms, that insofar as Bitcoin is going to either whatever Bitcoin does to the world financial system is going to be something it does to the US dollar, first of all, because the US dollar simply represents the world financial system. And the second point is also the big complication, just on a concrete level of what you said, would have been China. Like, when Bitcoin was big in China, it was dwarfing everything else. I could see it live. You know, there's. I'll try and find the link for this. You can go to a site and it just shows you in real time the Bitcoin activity in the world, and these Chinese Bitcoin exchanges were just glowing incandescently and overwhelming everything else. You know, and that's for a lot. The Chinese economy is weirdly virtualized in terms of money. Like, the amount of online financial transactions that happen in terms of just retail in China is vast, you know, and brick and mortar retailers in China are really threatened actually by this. The as a marketplace, in this just absolutely straightforward sense of just buying your baby's diapers over the net, China is just extraordinarily placed. So there's that factor, but more importantly is there is so much hot, corrupt money and money laundering demand in China. It's unbelievable. So, you know, the traditional ways, it's obviously Macau is the world's greatest gambling center now, because you have party officials turning up in Macau with their suitcases of hot money that they want to launder through the gaming tables, and if they only get half of it back, that's fine. You know, it's and Bitcoin for a long time seemed to be just a really nice low cost money laundering facility that totally fitted into that level of demand. So for both of those reasons, it was just huge, and as I say, just dwarfing Bitcoin activity in other centers. But then obviously I think the Chinese financial authorities really didn't like what seemed to be things slipping out of their control in this way, and they stamped down pretty hard on it. And people have said, I think persuasively, that basic market pattern of Bitcoin, that it goes up to over $1,100 and then crashes down to its current level of a bit over 200 or whatever, is totally based upon the Chinese authorities. So I think the fact that we've seen 80% or something close to that of the Bitcoin value being vaporized by perhaps, I mean, I'm not saying this is dogmatically certain, but let's just hypothetically, because of Chinese state intervention, is some indication of what was happening previously there, I think.
Yeah.
But so, yeah.
No, I totally agree with you. But again, I don't know, when we talk about the value of Bitcoin, we still talk about the value of Bitcoin against the dollar. One Bitcoin is still one Bitcoin, right? I don't know. I still have, I don't know, troubles to I don't know, to divorce the idea of, you know, or like an analysis of Bitcoin.
Right. Yeah.
From, you know, the rest that it's like embedded in. And I guess it perhaps relates to also, well, like the link that Ivan posted about the pricing surface of the market, because in my opinion we would have a very different pricing surface and of the source use, like if you know, if it were according to the logics of the blockchain. Unfortunately, there's no pricing surface in terms of Bitcoin, to my, I don't know, the way I see it. It would be perhaps something different. I don't know. I'm just,
Well, I think the thing is that the absolute formalism of Bitcoin means that it's not ever going to do people's political work for them unless their political work is for algorithmic government. You know, if the Chinese, if the UN dominated the world in the way the dollar does, then we would be thinking of the Bitcoin in UN or whatever it is going to be. You know, Bitcoin is just intrinsically absolutely neutral about that. And obviously that's again one of these ambivalent things, that one can take that as the basis of a critical stance in relation to it, or one can celebrate that. And, you know, it in itself is just a fact about this, a purely formal system, is that it's not going to take sides in a certain way. You know, it's only when you set up the deep ideological issue that the stance of algorithmic neutrality is itself a politics and therefore a side, which I think is highly defensible. But it's only then that it is caught within this system of ideological antagonism. And once you're at a more concrete level about the particular structures of the world order, it's going to be neutral on that, however frustratingly that might be.
Yeah, I actually agree with you on the fact that, I don't know, I tend to think that there is economics in itself is apolitical perhaps, and it's up to the sort of political formations that take up certain, like, I don't know. I mean, economics, I think the way, I don't know, I guess it says like economics as a tool of certain like political, I don't know, projects, but in itself perhaps it's, I don't know, I struggle to agree with I don't know, positions that see money as intrinsically political, for instance. I don't know, I tend to say the other way around, but again, I don't know.
Right.
I tend to, I don't know, I don't know, I still can I don't know, make up my mind on a lot of things, I guess.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, this obviously then intersects with the Brett Scott piece you linked to, and it is very interesting. I mean, I'm not sure really. This might be too big a thing to throw in here now, but in his first point, this money emerges from barter point. That for him is a myth, obviously, and it's referring to what I think is one of the most interesting. Well, no, whether it's really developed enough to call it a dispute yet. It's more of an intrinsic antagonism that hasn't really been worked out argumentatively between the position that really comes from Karl Menger, and is treated by the Austrians as their kind of gospel money, which is this barter position that shows money by solving the problem that is called technically the double coincidence of wants in barter systems. You get to a money system, and gold is then adopted as that currency of choice and remains for the Austrians obviously the model money as a valuable commodity, which is then taking it to a second hand. And the much more recent and I think for a lot of people very attractive and interesting position of David Graeber, which is refusing that model, and which actually Brett Scott, I think, a bit hastily is taking as gospel on the other side, which he seems to just say, look, it's now proven anthropologically that money does not arise from blood. I mean, to me, that is vastly fast, and I have to sort of see it as a political choice rather than a theoretical choice. But I think both of those positions are very important and need to be fully explicated, and they both are they both pull out very interesting things. I mean, obviously what David Graeber is saying is that the state and debt are always intrinsic to these money systems, and if you have a large-scale standardized system of money, that's already intrinsically involving these kind of institutions. And that's a point that I think is important, unquestionably important to make. But if we did get a chance to dig into this kind of exchange, the text that I really want to make sure people have seen, because I think it's also crucially important, is this Nick Szabo paper called Shelling Out. And I've sort of pushed it hard on early reading lists, because I think that the Nick Szabo position really doesn't easily get captured by that opposition. I think, for one thing, it goes back very, very far. I mean, he takes it right into sort of the Paleolithic, deep Paleolithic, and sort of early human evolution. So it's sort of the sort of David Graeber anthropological history move just doesn't get any purchase on it, and it manages to capture, I think, the important phenomena from both sides of that. It shows how money is tied up with notions of debt right from the start, and it also shows how money resolves these barter problems. So I think that is a very interesting triangle, but I'm probably going beyond what we can digest in this at this point here tonight.
Yeah, sorry, the last point. I read and I really enjoyed the Nick Szabo paper, because I guess that's a bit, he's got a position a bit more like Mengerian, right? Like I don't know, he tends to say it more like in the Austrian way, from my understanding. But on the other side, the way that he describes the way in which money, like, sort of was, I don't know, originated, it makes sense. Is that, it's a perfect, useful tool, like, that facilitates exchange without, I don't know, creating this dynamics of accumulation and like, well, obviously it was, again, Paleolithic. But again, I don't know, this is my point. I don't know, I tend not to agree with all the, like, positions, all the leftist critique of Bitcoin, but on the other side, I don't know, I don't really consider myself like a libertarian or a crypto-anarchist on the other side. But I find it, I don't know, right, because the blockchain, right, is neutral. I find it quite frustrating, I don't know, the fact that there hasn't been, I don't know, it hasn't been possible to create perhaps a system that again makes sense the same way that perhaps the ancient like proto-money made sense in those days. The kind of collectibles.
Right.
Obviously, we're not talking about collectibles like now, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Like it seems to me that the direction we're going now, also with the like peer-to-peer kind of like political, perhaps like I don't know, formalism of I mean, the apolitical, but still like this. I don't know. Finally, like managing of doing without or like eliminating the transcendental third party. It seems to me that it's moving increasingly in the direction of like the neoliberal, not the neoliberal, the liberal, the traditional like classical economic system of doing away with the I mean of I don't know, the invisible hand of the market. So I don't know. I guess I'm trying to look for an alternative, but I don't know like if there is one with the
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's a very interesting thing, and there's obviously is some very smart writing happening all around this topic. And I think the thing is there's a really difficult, for the left side of this discussion, there's a very difficult problem which is to do with the game theoretical use of money, because everybody wants other people's money to be political and their own money to be apolitical. I mean, no one has a game theoretical interest in the politicization of their own money, you know? And so obviously these left positions really require people to enter into, well, I think it might be, I mean, I might be being over hasty if I say unrealistic game theoretical positions, but they're positions that certainly require a very large degree of collective purpose being operational in people's choice of a money system and operation of a money system. You know, you go back to the sort of the Szabo thing, and I agree that he tends to be in this lineage. I think obviously the tech, this whole cypherpunk, cryptographic, game theoretical thread tends to be very cozy with Austrian economic ideas, because I think they share a lot of the same assumptions about agents and what counts as kind of local rationality for an agent. So they won't counter theory as being attractive to them unless it works in a situation where the agents in that system are pursuing quite narrowly conceived self-interest. You know, so that obviously puts them on a certain side of the political spectrum. But the Szabo thing, like it goes so deep into this biological. I mean, really is on the kind of cusp, isn't it, of the emergence of the human species being tied up with this use of collectibles, and he's got a kind of. It's a hypothetical claim, I'm assuming, rather than a particularly strong one, but it's extremely provocative, which is that Neanderthals were probably smarter than modern humans, but they didn't operate with collectibles. So that the kind of evolutionary advantage given to our ancestors by these forms of proto-currency was so overwhelming that it allowed for the complete displacement of an actually, in one narrowly defined sense, cognitively superior species. So sorry, I'm rambling. What I really wanted to get to with that was just this game theory element of it. You know, where it's all cashed out in these extremely basic imperatives to do with just feeding your kin, really. I mean, your tribe, it can be extended to, for sure. But, you know, he says the thing about these collectibles is they actually work as like fat reserves. You know, because you're knocking out a mammoth a month or something like that, and for 3 weeks you don't have enough food. And if you can engage in an exchange relationship with another group who just happen to be out of sync with you in their hunting pattern, you just simply have nourishment that would not be available to you under these other circumstances. So that level of just, you know, raw incentives is obviously what people are up against on the other side if they're trying to kind of use money as a tool for some very highly theorized purpose of kind of collective endeavor or something of that kind.
Yeah, thank you. No, thanks.
I mean, it's not clear to me, for instance, in Graeber's work, what his positive suggestion is, anything like as it's not as clear as his critique, is it? I mean, I don't know whether people disagree with that. You know, he obviously he wants to criticize a whole notions of money that would tend to legitimize it as it exists, and I'm sure would be extremely critical of Bitcoin and what's behind it. But in terms of what he's proposing as a monetary regime, it seems to really get the picture into focus.
Okay, maybe last thing, if no one else. I had another question regarding the, like, I don't know, game theory and I don't know, which again was in the Nick Szabo piece, together with the, he was referring to evolutionary, I don't know, evolutionary theory, like, and it seems to me that, I mean, game theory, as much as this evolutionary theory based again on the principle of the selfish gene, right? That works more or less, making like strategical decisions based on game theory. Isn't that like a bit reductive? I mean, it's just a model, right? So it's inherently reductive. I mean, it's a model, like game theory is a model of I don't know, the decision process. I guess
Right.
Obviously there are so many factors that intervene in, I don't know, informing the decision. So even there, I don't know. I can't really. I don't know. I find it hard to accept. Which was in fact my one perhaps like question in the Nick Szabo piece. Is his, I don't know, reliance on game theory and
Right.
on evolutionary theories based on game theory again.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. But I think this is right. And again, I saw a piece recently. It's a bit off our topic, because it's a general critique of what they call neoliberalism. But it really, I thought, was fascinating because it draws the genealogy of neoliberalism, as it calls it, through this game theory tradition in a way that I've never seen done so clearly before. And for instance, John Nash, who's critical in our tradition, referred to massively. I mean, some people even said, a bit crazily probably, but that they've even said maybe Satoshi Nakamoto is John Nash. That's how close it is. And to put that tradition going through Thomas Schelling and all of the game theoretical process, then going into public choice theory and all of this as being the core intellectual momentum heading into what we now see or is being denounced, obviously, as this neoliberal political and economic culture. And I thought it was very interestingly done. And so I think for sure, it's probably necessary the game theory is probably this crucial nexus, as you're saying, for this political decision making, and the people, I think, who we're involved with just because they're the Bitcoin people, they like game theory because it's formalistic. Just like the protocol itself, you have nodes, you have agents, you don't have to specify anything about them except that they will play to win rationally. And I don't think the assumption there, which is again obviously derided as kind of isomorphic with notions of homo economicus, even with the notion of perfect markets, with a whole series of these logical constructs or regulative ideas in the Kantian sense. But I don't think it's saying people are rational. It's saying that selective pressure is directed towards the rewarding of rationality, that whoever plays this game rationally will win. So in these game theoretical setups, whether it's prisoner's dilemma or any of the chicken or any of these kind of things, it's not to say we are going to assume axiomatically that the agents involved are rational. It's rather that this is the framework of this game, and if you don't play it rationally, you will lose this game. And when you then translate that into a sort of, in the broadest sense, Darwinian framework, obviously most comfortably in biology, but then these analogies between Darwinian evolution and structures of kind of competitive market economics are not trivial. I mean, there's something going on there because when you translate it into biological terms, this claim, the rational player will win, becomes something that you're actually plugging into this selective machine, your reality. So this is why biologists, it's no coincidence that game theory has proven to be an extremely useful tool for them. Because if you're going to be Darwinian at all, and you're going to say that there is a process of natural selection of successful strategies, then game theory is just saying, well, look, let's formalize what is a successful strategy. And we would expect, therefore, that in all of these examples, wherever we're looking, even at the most elementary organism, an organism that is bad at playing games, and game theory tells you what that is, will be selected out. So that competence, game theoretical competence, is something you would expect to be selected for by any kind of Darwinian mechanism, whatever level that is operating at. And so I think that's where, for instance, Nick Szabo is coming from.
Thanks.
So this is a question completely out of some kind of like hazy space. But
Right, good.
doesn't that suppose a kind of a particular account of reason? That it's instrumental in order to play the, the game. And I wonder maybe if
Right.
if you thought about this kind of instrumental kind of discourses, it's also the kind of reason that to me seems to be prevalent in places like Less Wrong and the way that reason is talked about there, compared to the kind of reason that.
Sorry, I just missed that. Prevalent where? In West Rom, that sounds like to me. In where?
Less Wrong, the blog.
Oh, yes, that rationalist. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there's a big microsociological intersection between those guys, or maybe not big actually, because when you actually the ideological surveys of Less Wrong was always weirdly leftist actually, but that surprises me. Yeah.
But there's still a particular account of reason that's operative here,
Right,
and
sure.
it is, I think, an instrumental account.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you'd thought about alternative accounts of reason, and I mean, to kind of give a fuzzy indication of where I'm heading with this, without having to actually sit and explain it right now, towards Peirce, towards the kind of stuff that Reza Negarestani is talking about. And Ray Brassier and other people, this autonomous reason, which definitely returns to a pseudo-Hegelian idea of like an autonomous unfolding
but
reason,
then,
but one that is completely transcendental.
If that's okay, sorry, I know I'm interrupting you, but I'm just my big question then is like, has that broken totally with naturalism? Like, if I was then to say, well, how could such a thing like if I was saying, look, reason only exists because it's instrumental. It's not because there's some notion of instrumental reason that is preferred in advance. It's just that the instrumentality of reason is the actual condition of possibility for reason existing at all within a naturalistic Darwinian framework. If reason wasn't instrumental, it would not exist. And except as maybe some kind of weird spandrel. I mean, there are exotic accounts of how something can somehow slip past natural selection by accident. But if this thing is something of huge importance, of like almost cosmic significance, it seems to me that's a weak foundation to rest on. And so you really want to say, well, how naturalistically could this thing possibly have come to be? Now, obviously, that's why instrumental reason is the way it is, and why it's defined the way it is, and how it's defined is that it's that thing, it's that characteristic of reason that allows reason to be selected for. And if you take that away, where has reason come from? Why should it exist? How could it exist?
Yes.
Mo, was that you?
Indeed, it was.
So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
This question and answer clarified so much for me.
But okay, so two things. There's an account, for example, in Sellers, about how reason, the kind of autonomous reason that is distinguished from instrumental reason, actually does evolve completely through natural selection, via kind of like pattern recognition. And kind of develops like a conceptual ability on top of that basic kind of instrumental reasoning,
Right.
which leads it to the
okay.
that develop concepts, and then allows a kind of a completely pragmatic use of this particular faculty in order to kind of you don't have to posit a gap between natural selection and the laws of nature and conceptual reasoning.
But look, I mean, I'm partly just confessing my ignorance of this tradition. But if it's the case that this other non-instrumental reason, inverted commas, emerged out of pattern recognition, isn't that totally instrumental? I mean, pattern recognition there's pattern recognition because pattern recognition is instrumental. I mean, if pattern recognition without instrumental value would also not have any selective reinforcement and would pose the same problem that we're starting off with here. So I don't know how you've moved beyond instrumentality. I mean, it's like the very moment something starts happening that is non-instrumental, it is no longer subject to Darwinian reinforcement, and therefore its existence becomes miraculous in a naturalistic sense.
So maybe can I just interject?
Yeah, sure.
So maybe here what we're talking about is like the liminality between instrumental reason and instrumentalized reason. Is the ED that kind of like make a difference between what Amy is sort of like critiquing and what you're reasserting. So instrumental reason and instrumentalized reason, because the ED makes it sort of like some sort of like a sinister human agency that's trying to somehow actually take the instrumental reason and totally distort it and put it towards particular agendas. I don't know if it was helpful or useful what I said, but I'm asking that.
But would Amy be prepared to go along with that, I wonder? I mean,
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're getting at, Mo, but the thing that jumped to mind when you were saying that was the distinction that Reza makes, probably coming from someone else.
Reza's distinction is always instrumentalized reason, I think, from what I remember. And
I don't know, maybe we should get Reza in here.
Yeah, totally. That's why I said, where's Reza? Not instrumental reason. Because the way you brought the pattern recognition example and basically how reason proceeds is through instrumentality. I mean, that's why I thought like Nick was like really right on when he said that.
Like I said, I'm just chucking this out there because it popped into my mind when you guys were talking about the kind of the agent of these particular theorizations of economics, and I wondered.
Yeah.
And
I think it's helpful
out of a completely neutral position as well.
Sure.
From observing the way that these two discourses kind of antagonize each other.
Sure, it's very helpful. And to be honest, though, my question remains the same: is whether the claim to a non-instrumental rationality. So this isn't Mo's distinction. This is the one that I thought was at play here. Whether that involves an explicit repudiation of Darwinian naturalism, or whether it somehow thinks that it is compatible with that naturalistic framework. So that's something I'm just not clear about. But if it is compatible, then it's hard to see how you could have leverage against this role that game theory is playing in these discussions, because game theory at its most abstract level is simply attaching itself to the instrumentality of reason. There's no notion of rationality in it that is anything other than that that way of processing a problem that will lead to winning games or arriving at optimal outcomes in games. And those games, obviously, when you put it into this deeper naturalistic context, are just these survival games. Therefore, winning those games is simply a precondition of existing in the first place within this naturalistic grid, a tradition or heritage of having orientation such that games have been won over the last 4 billion years is how everything has been put together within this framework. So if you're going to say that this game theoretic framework is somehow a limited one, then that seems to me to appeal to some foundation of existence that is radically independent of this kind of naturalistic process.
I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I think that the account
sure.
goes that it's that this kind of conceptualization is consonant with with the account of like the emergence of consciousness, natural selection.
Right.
It just an instrumental reason. It doesn't exclude it in any way, but it then provides a layer on top of that.
Right.
And this is the sticking point, which corresponds with human agency, which gives agency over and above natural laws, so that there is a way of intervening and manipulating them that allows traction in order to divert, whatever the universe is doing towards a different end. And this is where you get what looks like the imposition of a bunch of transcendent regulations, except that if the account is correct, they are emergent from within the transcendental space, game space, or whatever. But I mean, whether or not that's how tractable that is a different question.
Yes, I mean it's intriguing, definitely, and obviously the emergentism of it is interesting, but there's also a kind of paradoxical side to it because, games theory is extremely agent-oriented theorizing, isn't it? I mean, it's really, there'd be I don't think this is used because of the fact that it just is so functional, and the Darwinian tradition has now put together such good translation protocols for this. But there's at least a kind of implicit or virtual hypernaturalistic objection to the use of games theory in deep biology that would precisely say it's, aren't you being too teleological to use these models about rational agents when you're describing the evolution of bacterial nets? Or, I mean, it would go in exactly the opposite direction in a way to this line of critique, and it would say the games theorists are retrospectively transporting these agency models way beyond their zone of application into systems that obviously not only don't have consciousness or social identities or explicit deliberated purposes, but maybe don't have any kind of nervous system whatsoever. So what I'm saying there is, with this supervenient layer of non-instrumental rationality being postulated in the name of agency, how is that producing kind of leverage on the theory of games? It seems that the theory of games is already like talking about agents almost to a fault.
I suppose that it just means that it's not the only paradigm within which to work, that it provides one, but you could perhaps, I don't know, build an economics on a normative paradigm to bring out the N word.
Right.
But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I am just kind of like throwing knives into the dark right here. So
Yeah. I mean, they're very
That's
interesting knives. I apologize that for my incompetence to kind of catch them properly equally. I mean, you know, I find this kind of hazy Hegelian very hard to process adequately. So it would be interesting to, yeah.
Well, it is called there's that aphorism, like entering the game of giving and asking for reasons, space of reasons, whatever. And that synoptic picturing, I'm talking Sellers now, the scientific image, whatever, it is rule-based, you know, whether these rules are congruent with those of game theory is doubtful, but like, you know, the rule pattern process layering of that autonomous reason, it does seem fairly instrumental, I think. So it's interesting to think about in that way too.
Yeah.
Mo, you have
Yeah.
something to say about this.
Well, I actually was just thinking about like about what you were saying. So give me a couple of minutes to see what I can think of, because I immediately noticed what you were saying was already kind of like pointing to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just
the way for me to collapse it into this conversation, or to the conversation about games, or conversation about instrumentality, is to think a little bit like, what do they call it, STS, and like science studies, and how like the intersubjectivity of the establishment of what is the scientific image, what goes into each discipline's own reliance still on manifest image to even come up with scientific models, and then what it takes at the level of meta-science or philosophy for these disciplinal images that are still quasi-manifest to sort of like leave their manifest residues and kind of like come together and be telescoped together into a scientific image. These things do not happen in a vacuum, right? And they all involve some form of like instrumentalization and game playing and kind of like building of intersubjectivity. It takes all sorts of like rules and games, and I mean that's what I can think of right now to relate Sellars to the conversation, right? And see if it's if a Sellarsian idea of rationality is compatible with what Nick is talking about in terms of instrumental reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
I mean,
well put.
Sorry. If I'm understanding this right, it would have to be that this Sellarsian superstructure it would not be reducible to saying its criterion for validity, or its criterion for let's just say its ultimate criterion of this rationality would not be reducible to the fact that it is a game-winning orientation. I mean, this. I mean, obviously, my sort of natural inclination here, and sort of you can take natural as deliberated as possible, is to sort of think that what's being postulated is almost some kind of inflection point of species suicide, at which the successfulness, the actual, the instrumental value of its cognitive processes are somehow cross this threshold and cease to be a criterion. And it opens up this wonderful domain of dysfunctional cognition that can be completely incompatible with these naturalistic conditions of preservation and perpetuation, and allow obviously all kinds of things, and you can respond, oh, the fact that this is losing the game does not matter. You're not understanding. This is meta-instrumental, transcendent, normative rationality. You're not getting at it, at its value, at its importance, at its emancipatory power, if you're reducing it to successfully winning a game. But then, obviously, from the other side, one would expect it to, therefore, tend to lose the game and therefore be edited out of some naturalistically regulated reality.
I think the main point is that it doesn't just make game theory a measure of intelligence. It posits a kind of intelligence that operates within game theory successfully, but then isn't limited to that kind of intelligence. I mean, and the ultimate upshot of this is that it becomes a program for an artificial intelligence in all of the people I've referred to. So you get a different level of intelligence as your AGI.
But that's maybe partly because you don't want that intelligence to be too good at winning games, is that? So in a way, it's a kind of
maybe
it's a kind of impositional altruism that will prevent this superintelligence being too good at playing games and therefore being a threat. Am I just like projecting my own paranoid framework onto this situation?
No, I mean, I think it's developed explicitly as a way out of that paranoid framework, and whether or not that makes it less real is the question.
I mean, obviously, from the side of the paranoid brutalism, given a fragmentary set of development programs, the competitive dynamics between them will favor the kind of raw instrumental versions of intelligence over the normative sort of altruistic versions of intelligence, and therefore your AI, your cuddly AI program is nice from the perspective of the humans who are feeling threatened by it, but it's incompetent in comparison to these more sort of raw game playing intelligences that are being put together elsewhere. I mean, it's really is this thing about whether there is some kind of horizon of the Darwinian criterion. Do you think that's right?
Yeah.
I was going to ask if you think that the proof of work or intelligence in Bitcoin could evolve in a corresponding manner to this discussion of instrumentality. I mean, how can mining? I mean, can it just get more and more complicated, and can just certain people have developed the capacity for it, or do you think there's potential for a broadening of that? But then again, that might be leading into what you wanted to talk about next.
Yeah, I think it does actually a lot. But there's no reason why we can't at least entertain it a little bit. I mean, obviously, the interesting thing about this proof of work thing is that it's designed in some ways to preclude intelligence. in the sense that if these puzzles that were being solved were such that there was some it was open in principle to some mathematical discovery by an intelligent program that allowed it to massively increase its hashing rate out of proportion to its actual investment of computing power, then that would subvert the Bitcoin system. I mean, that would put the whole Bitcoin economy in the hands of this super intelligent computer. And so the whole thing has actually been designed to prevent that outcome. You know, the sort of zone where that type of dynamics could occur, you're out in space and these other ones. The Bitcoin protocol itself is actually intrinsically protected against super intelligence getting it represented in the system.
It's fascinating.
So it purely...
Continue. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's it for sure. But I mean, it's like the relation between Bitcoin and superintelligence production is certainly going to be more circuitous and complicated than the notion of the actual hashing industry leading up some track towards artificial intelligence, which is something that has supposedly been prevented. I mean, you know, if there's mathematical proof in a way, in the sense that the problems that are being set, the hash function it has to fulfill is one that cannot be resolved except by brute force, and therefore, in theory, by the most stupid possible thought process. And this is something we find everywhere. Obviously, it's like it's the same with the these asymmetric functions we've been looking at today in terms of cryptography. It's like, if there was possibly an intelligent mathematical solution for prime factorization, then crypto security would be immediately vaporized. You know, because someone somewhere could find a way from extracting the two prime factors from some 256-bit prime number, and bang, you know, you've lost your asymmetry immediately, and that whole cryptographic system is completely destroyed. So that too, you know, the thing about the net of Eratosthenes with primes is it is, in exactly the same way as these hash functions, stupid brute force method that you just try, work your way through by trial and error through the whole series until eventually you hit the right number. And obviously, because this is something we've, you know, also been talking about, Darwinian mechanics are the same, at least to some extent, in terms of trial and error systems.
Thanks.
So I just wanted to say that we got about 5 minutes before the next time is up. If you guys want to talk about camouflage, maybe, and I'm really interested in that conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe someone should bring it up, at least maybe as a starting point, because maybe 5 minutes is not enough. Laura, do you want to talk about camouflage, or Amy?
I think maybe I talked enough.
No, I don't think anyone. I'm the only one who's talked enough.
Jake is not with us today, which is kind of like just a big hole in the class without Jake. Rick, it's like.
Well, the one thing I would say is that I find the camouflage of the blockchain completely uncomplicated. In that it doesn't seem to be the fact that it doesn't really work on any complex set of levels means that its camouflage seems to be, I don't know, not particularly interesting, and I don't know if it would work in that kind of sense. We want to talk about it in those terms.
Yes, but I mean, if the camouflage is between what something is going to be and what it appears as in its initial state, is that something that could really be denied to Bitcoin? I mean, it's like, I think right across the whole spectrum from deep antagonist to massively enthusiastic fan, there's at least the understanding that this could be something massive and unpredictable. And as you say, what we can see now is something that looks so simple and formulaic that it can be presented in this open source public document. So, I mean, isn't that a kind of camouflage of a kind of virtual event camouflaged as a piece of public open software?
Yeah, for sure. I wasn't thinking about it stupidly. I wasn't thinking about it in terms of temporality.
I mean, I think this is this open secret thing to me, is that precisely it always will be open to your kind of objection. The way it hides is not the traditional, it's not traditional camouflage. It doesn't hide by not being seen. It hides by being completely visible, but being in some way twinned to an obscurity, you know, by this systematic relationship. And it seems to me that that's definitely what Bitcoin does.
Would that be then, like it would suit perhaps the term, like it would be more a terms, a kind of steganography than cryptography.
A kind of,
Because
a kind of what?
A kind of steganography.
Right.
So it's something where the thing that's being smuggled in is like the key. I know that doesn't work perhaps because the key in steganography is completely in the open. It just needs to be decrypted.
Yeah.
I don't know. I need to think on that more.
Yes, these different types of obscurity, for sure. But I mean, I think it's definitely the case that there is this threshold of transition that is marked by this history of cryptography, where a certain it previously was the case that something was encrypted if the encryption, if the cipher was simply hidden. You know, it was conspirator, it was transcendent in that sense of being, it's not in circulation, it's outside as a precondition of the system, and it has been shared by conspiracy, not by cryptographic communication. And then you cross into this whole new regime where, which is the regime of the open secret, where the form of hiding is completely different. And yes, I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to say, I think these questions about camouflage, well, steganography is like, I can see, sorry, I missed who. I think it was Chris saying about, or was it, God, sorry, about Burroughs anyway. Yeah, Chris saying about Burroughs saying draw as little attention to something as possible. So that's kind of the steganography thing, isn't it? Where it hides by you not seeing there's anything hidden at all. Now that's very different. That's very different to the basic type of hiding that we've been looking at this time, because everyone knows if there's a public key, everyone knows there's a private key. So there's no secretion of the secret at all. The secret is hidden by this mathematical relationship, not by the fact that you don't know there's something there. But whether Bitcoin as a whole has some kind of steganographic invisibility to it, because that is implied by your criticism, isn't that? I mean, when you say it's simply, you know, my eyes bounce off it, dazed with boredom, is this steganographic relationship, isn't it? To say there's not a, it's not sucking you into it.
Yeah. You turned that around on me completely. Nice. Thanks.
So well, I wasn't trying to be deliberately sadistic about it. I thought it was kind of the point, but maybe I'm.
No. I enjoyed it.
God, all this like Nick's one-liners can all be like really popular like Facebook statuses. I really enjoyed the one you said earlier on. You said, I hope I'm not projecting my paranoia framework onto this, for which Amy had a very great and opposite response. Anyways, we're now a little bit over, like a few minutes. So if anyone has a final question or comment, this is the time to make it, or we can maybe end on this note.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of things that are going on in the sidebar that I'll definitely be interested to follow up.
I'm actually copying it right now to paste it in the classroom.
Yeah.
I didn't lose a session today, so I'm able to do it myself, and I'm doing it right now.
Okay, yeah, that's greatly appreciated. Thanks. Do you think that Jake's away because he exhausted himself so badly by putting up the information last week? That
could be, but I also I try to contact him, but he probably just caught up somewhere, and he's gonna have to watch it if he wants to continue. I'm sure he will. I tried to message him earlier on, but he didn't respond, and he didn't look at a message, so I'm sure he's not around.
Right. Yeah. No problem.
Okay. So thanks everyone for participation. Thank you so much, Nick, for this great.
Thank everybody a lot for this, and I'm sorry if it seemed a bit chopped up compared. Sometimes we get total flow, and sometimes there's some choppiness to it. But I've got a lot out of this, so I'm very grateful to everybody.
Okay, so I'm going to end the broadcast and see you all next week, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the second last seminar.
Okay, great.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. Have a good week.